Alright guys, so welcome to our lecture on the Expressionist resurgence. And it's called the Expressionist resurgence because it's really not the first time in history that we've seen this kind of art architecture, as you know from the previous lectures. But especially here at this moment when the international style reached its widest extent, its widest diffusion in the 60s and 70s, questions of artistic invention and monumentality began to pull at the edges of functionalism, began to deconstruct this fantasy that functionalism was the way of the future. So at first, Expressionist architecture reappeared, and I say reappeared, since the Art Nouveau in Europe, in America, kind of like an afterthought, and these are things we've seen. So, in 1954, as you remember, Le Corbusier shocked the world with the unveiling of Notre Dame du Hat and Ronchamp. During the same period, Frank Lloyd Wright went against the grid of New York with his Guggenheim Museum, and these works, kind of acted as a prelude and a permission to a worldwide exploration of expressionist forms and sort of more organic shapes which broke off from the common sense solutions of functionalism. They contradicted intentionally the economic logic of the prefabricated kind of rational projects of the international style. Expressionist architecture was architecture for art's sake. For the first time in architectural and art history, works in buildings became completely detached from politics or religion. Abstract architecture was an architectural movement for its own sake. It wasn't attached to socialism, communism, totalitarianism, nationalism, or creating a country's identity. It was about the architect expressing themselves. Therefore, there isn't much to say about these works. They are, modern art pieces, but I'm going to do my best in this class as, your textbook has done its best. So, as I said, the Expressionist trend originally descended from the organic forms of the Art Nouveau. So in this way, in a weird sort of way, this is kind of using almost a historical revival to combat the international style taking over, just like how, the neoclassicists and the neogoticists were battling against factories taking over their cities. History, repeats itself. While the international style, provided a dull but sensible theory for modern architecture, Expressionism reappeared in Europe and America in pursuit of these unfamiliar, non-geometric forms, to specifically rebel against the right-angled functionalism of the international style appearing literally everywhere. The earliest really stirrings of the Expressionist revival originated actually in Finland even before the outbreak of World War II. Alvar Aalto initially prevailed as the Finnish protagonist of functionalism, using pure planes, strip windows, and absolutely no decoration. But at the Pamio Sanatorium, he experimented for the first time with more expressive non-geometric architecture. And we're talking about this now because Alvar Aalto would really lead the way after World War II to progressing Europe towards a more sort of expressionist approach in avant-garde architecture circles. This is essentially a tuberculosis hospital seeking optimal exposure to sunlight in the woods. And though the building represents the modernist period of Aalto's career and followed many of the tenets of Le Corbusier's pioneering ideas for modernist architecture, with ribbon windows, with roof terraces, with the machine aesthetic, it also carried the seeds of Aalto's later move towards a more, synthetic approach. For instance, the main entrance is marked by this kind of nebula-shaped canopy, unlike anything really designed at any time by the older generation of modernist architects. And it features these kind of curving balconies, and the whole building is bent at an angle off the international grid. A decade later, he and his wife designed the Villa Maria for their friends. The terrace, upper pop-out windows, and entry canopy kind of assumed these very free forms, kind of like parasites attaching themselves to a rational L-shaped plan. And here in this building, kind of like Frank Lloyd Wright, they celebrated raw materials from fieldstone to birch saplings as a kind of honest decoration. They even added a log structure covered by none other than a sod roof for a sauna, connecting itself to the main house by a causeway of pilotis. In 1952, just after World War II, Alto completed this town hall for this small factory town. And as you can see, Alto built all of these jagged volumes and rooms in brick and placed a tower with a single peaked roof at the entry. He also personalized all the details that most involved human interactions, just like an arts and crafts architect. So, for example, he spanned the council chamber with these decorative tree-like rafters. He gracefully laced leather straps around the door handles. And the very four wings of the complex crowned an artificial hill with grassy steps cascading down from a central court. And so this building itself really marks the beginning of the Expressionist resurgence, beginning in 1952 and continuing all the way throughout the 1970s. You know, it's at this point that architecture for the sake of itself, architecture for the sake of art, finally returns to the West, lost since the days of Art Nouveau and arts and crafts. Alto also designed several churches. You know, his very unorthodox approach, breaking away from the right-angled grid structure and program of historical modernists, is best seen in the three-lobed Church of the Three Crosses. And these are the very buildings that would inspire Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier to break from the international grid once more and kind of experiment with these expressionist forms like in the Guggenheim Museum and the Ronskamp Chapel. The Danish architect Johan Utzon was one of Alto's assistants and actually the first European to push popular taste in favor of Expressionism again with this very famous work. So he actually won the competition to design the Sydney Opera House in 1957, and the building took 14 whole years to construct. It was so avant-garde, it was so cutting edge, and so unlike anything else on the planet. Construction began in 1963, but Utzon redesigned in 1966 under pressure of cost overruns exceeding over 1,000%. You know, like many other Expressionist architects, his vision had outrun his funds. He nonetheless left behind a work of organic monumentality that became kind of, you know, synonymous with Sydney and the most unabashed Expressionist vision yet realized. I mean, look at this just interposed on the background, which is still largely full of international style buildings even today. So this is, if you were unaware, a theater and opera center containing two massive theaters, and these two theaters were capped by these kind of triple hooded reinforced concrete shells whose kind of billowing forms suggest images of, you know, crashing wave, crashing turf, or some people see them as, you know, sailing ships. But what a lot of people don't realize is the absolutely innovative engineering Johan incorporated to make such an impossible structure possible. He used, you know, within these reinforced concrete shells, something called post-tensioned reinforced concrete, and this innovation would make so many later Expressionist works possible, even though they look structurally impossible. So the reinforced concrete shells were built like normal, you know, using woven steel rebar cables with, you know, the concrete set around just like was done in the past. But then the rebar cables are tensioned and post-tensioned after the fact to create these compressive forces within the structure, stabilizing these shells to balance on these very tiny points. And so post-tension concrete allowed for the construction of longer spans, thinner and lighter structures, and reduced cracking compared to regular reinforced concrete. It was essentially combining, you know, the same technology that holds up a tent with reinforced concrete to create something very expressive and impossible looking. And then to pretty everything up, the exterior of the shells were covered with precast polished concrete panels, waterproofing the shells and allowing the opera house to gleam like a star all around. And finally, underneath the shells, there was no need to add structural supports with the post-tensioned concrete holding everything in place, so floor-to-ceiling glass curtain walls were added to offer panoramic views of the harbor and allow natural light to flood into the interior. You know, this amazing building was said to be like a church for theater. When opened, the Sydney Opera House contained a concert hall, an opera theater, a drama theater, a playhouse, rehearsal studios, offices, and several restaurants. Its only drawback to its functional approach was its acoustics were very bad. It's not really a functional building, it's more of an art piece, so we've had to adapt even to make it so much as handicap accessible. Utzon's major work in Denmark, this suburban church in a suburb of Copenhagen, was a more subtle example of Expressionism. On the exterior, it appeared kind of like an anonymous industrial shed, clad with these kind of horizontal concrete panels, but on the inside, it was Expressionist to the max. On the inside, the ceilings suspended from the roof descended as these kind of curved concrete vaults coated and finished with wood and plaster that seemed to swirl like a great unrolled piece of fabric. And this, to him, reflects the idea of a Christian person. Believing, as most Christians do, that it's not the external appearance or struggles that really matter to God, but the state of one's heart. So along this idea, the exterior of the church is very plain and bland and orthogonal, but the inside of the church, the interior, is very expressive and emotional. And the only light coming into the building was on the cribs of the ceilings, kind of capturing this diffused light from these mysterious upper clerestory windows and reflecting down into the church. But the parishioners couldn't directly see out of the windows or even see where the windows came from, creating this kind of atmosphere of mystery. And this creates kind of a serene and ethereal atmosphere within the church, with the light, playing a significant role in enhancing the worship experience. And you can see just how vast and kind of contemplative the central nave is, this uninterrupted space with these high ceilings like a Gothic cathedral and the expansive but hidden windows, allowing the congregation to connect with the outside environment through light but not be distracted by it. In post-war Germany, the international style, as you can guess, prevailed as the very safe alternative to the Nazi past, but already in the late 1950s, you had architects like Hans Scharoun very heavily experimenting with the Expressionist style. Scharoun's Expressionism responded to the call of an anti-totalitarian monumentality. It was such a stark distinction to Nazi Germany's old landmarks. Scharoun worked the interiors of his buildings with kind of this very dynamic intersection of flat surfaces and angled surfaces, so that as you moved through his buildings, the perspectives continued to change. And in the end, he actually had a major role in the reconstruction of post-war Berlin. He designed this building, the Philharmonie, this kind of tent-like concert hall, and also one of the most important other buildings in Berlin, the Staatsbibliothek, the city's primary library. And would you guess a similar reaction surfaced in post-fascist Italy? First of all, paving the way was this very prominent anti-fascist critic, author, and architect Bruno Zevi, who really promoted Expressionism as the architectural face to replace the old buildings of fascist Italy. His relentless campaign of publications and buildings and designs really paved the way for a realization of organic architectural expression in post-fascist Italy in order to rid themselves of their previous fascist associations, becoming a really surprisingly big haven for Expressionist architecture. And here is a great example. St. John the Baptist of the Highway by Giovanni Maisalucci is this church set just outside Florence in 1964 by a freeway. And you'll notice the base of the church appeared kind of primitive and grotto-like with these bulging stone walls. And then the copper-clad roof kind of swoops up like a tent, and the south side takes the shape of kind of a drooping catenary curve, and the interior has these kind of tilting concrete masts that branch out and hold the great vault in place. It's this very, very unique take on a church, and very brave to build just outside the Renaissance capital that is Florence. But you have to understand, the 60s and the 70s in Italy was a time when, any educated architect wanted to present their liberal thinking, anti-fascist intellectual virtues through an over-exaggerated act of kind of starting over with art and architecture, since every historical architectural movement in Italy has these connotations of being favored by the fascists. And these post-fascist generations of Italian architects were actually really interested in Frank Lloyd Wright's theory of organic architecture, and among them, one of the most famous that appropriated Wright's theory of organic architecture was this Italian architect, Carlo Scarpa. And you could see, right off the bat how much of a pioneer he was for Scarpa. Unity Temple with its cast concrete designs, the Imperial Hotel, the textile block houses, these all were major inspirations for Scarpa here, as you can tell just from looking at this before you even know what it is. This is, I don't think you'd be able to tell just by looking at it, but this is actually a family tomb site for this very wealthy industrialist family living near Treviso. This is a kind of alien looking site where all of the entries to the tombs are mysterious and indirect. Some of the tombs don't even look like tombs. He constructed the entire environment in this porous concrete and then used frequently these kind of sawtooth moldings, which sometimes pushed into the walls and sometimes protruded from them, which kind of reminds you of Frank Lloyd Wright's Unity Temple. And as you walk across this tomb complex, you come across these kind of never again repeated follies. You have, these bubble-like discs as entries into tombs, or these kind of linked circles, or these kind of mysterious single lines of multicolored tiles. This is art as architecture in the highest sense. And so in this cemetery, Scarpa essentially carried out this battle against the conformity and banality of the international style. And across the ocean, as I said, the really first example of expressionist architecture in America was Frank Lloyd Wright's Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York, which, as you know, opened in 1959, just a few months after his death. And by this time, as we said in the last lecture, American corporations had become really the dominant economic power and sort of adopted the international style to sort of paint themselves as forward-thinking and machine-like. Wright lived just enough to kind of see this internationalizing of New York. But in contrast to all of this corporate international style, the New York Museum of Modern Art and the arts market in New York in general promoted the enormous canvases of abstract expressionist art, the very art which hung on the walls now in this time period in the Museum of Modern Art. So Expressionism really wasn't just an architecture movement, but is where the artistic consciousness was going in America, going against the praise of the sharp, right-angled industrial aesthetic so popular since World War I. Jackson Pollock and Martha Rothko conceived their enormous expressive paintings, which now started to hang in museums and private collections all over New York. So abstract expressionism in architecture and in art made a virtue of liberation from the structures of representation and remained totally void of political context. It was about the aesthetic and emotion, not the ideals and agendas, really for the first time in history. Contrast this with the art movement Le Corbusier was interested in. Purism wanted the world to embrace industry and machine age aesthetics, but expressionism was art for art's sake. It was about aesthetics and expression. It was not about promoting an agenda, promoting a national identity, promoting a cultural identity, promoting politics, or promoting a religion. So amid this kind of tension of corporate international architecture versus abstract expressionism, Eero Saarinen absorbed kind of influences in both directions, so he really started out as an international architect. He produced, some of the most orthodox international style buildings for corporate clients in his early career, but his first breakthrough came through in 1947 when he won a competition to design the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial in St. Louis, or better known as the Gateway Arch, winning with a 630-foot stainless steel post-tension concrete-clad catenary arch. So here he's taking the engineering from the Sydney Opera House. This was essentially a monument meant to commemorate the Louisiana Purchase, but it was entirely abstract and expressionist. And from here, he pursued abstract expressionism in university settings even. Beginning at MIT in 1953 with this kind of segmental vault of the Kresge Auditorium, the auditorium at Kresge. It was essentially this immense triangular post-tension concrete canopy anchored to 3 pin joints, so kind of functioning like the Sydney Opera House. And this kind of bulging theater accompanied the Kresge Chapel nearby, clad in clinker bricks. The arches of the base on the outside, these kind of differently sized, expressive arches hint at the very irregular, wavy walls of the interior. At the Ingle Hockey Rink at Yale University, built in 1958, Saarinen created one of the most dynamic structures in the country, this kind of stingray-shaped roof design built exactly like a cabled bridge. These regularly spaced steel cables were hung from a single concrete arch to support the thin covering of wood and copper that formed the roof, almost looking like the upturned hull of a ship or the back of a stingray with its kind of projecting out tail right above the front entrance. Saarinen actually created his most expressive works for airports, the TWA building at Kennedy Airport in New York and the Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. were both completed by him in 1961. With the TWA terminal, the patrons actually hired Saarinen in an attempt to creatively outflank Pan Am for international travel, this company which was building all these boring international style airports. They knew Saarinen would make their airport into an absolute work of art. And in the end, he designed this very flamboyant, futuristic bird-like hub that contained 4 terminals. The terminal's 4 vaults swept up from post-tension concrete trunks, allowing the interior to hover over these massive pointed glass windows overlooking the runways and allowing the interior to be made up of non-structural reinforced concrete, undulating into curving bridges and electronic schedule boards within lily-shaped pedestals. But despite the terminal's fluid shapes, the airport proved inflexible. It couldn't really be expanded on or added to as air travel became more popular and more people traveled, and they would have needed to add more terminals. So this airport really became obsolete as the flight industry expanded. Saarinen's Dulles Airport, though, had much better luck. At Dulles Terminal, Saarinen essentially suspended a grand post-tensioned concrete canopy from a series of outward thrusting reinforced concrete piers, essentially building a massive tensioned concrete tent. The concave glazed walls between the piers served as these multiple entry points and docking points, and it was easily expanded. In fact, it doubled to 30 bays in the 1980s to keep up with the growing travel industry. Very few American architects during the 1950s rivaled Saarinen's sculptural exploits. Really only Marcel Breuer, this German from the Bauhaus, could command a kind of comparatively fluid vocabulary of molded concrete forms like Saarinen. So for St. John's University Church at Collegeville, Minnesota, he designed massive curving legs to hold up this vertical concrete plane carrying a very expressive cross and bells. Across the plaza at Alcuin Library, Breuer laid essentially a waffle slab ceiling on a colossal trunk-like column with spreading branches, kind of reminiscent of the Sagrada Familia, rendered in this kind of brutalist concrete, but very expressive, kind of brutalism done right in a sense here. Many expressionist works in America, though, occurred in these kind of marginal private situations. Bruce Goff here was actually an apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright and was heavily influenced, just like him, by Native American culture. So he pursued kind of these unconventional forms using exotic materials naturally found in Oklahoma. At the Bavinger House, which he built in 1955, it was built with his students for an expressionist artist in his family. And essentially, it's wrapped in a spiral sequence of spaces around a central steel mast borrowed from local oil rigs. The structure kind of mixed light steel and glass elements with rough stonework, and the house was essentially this single room, but divided the spaces into distinct zones. But like so many expressionist works, this house was a heroic effort to resist mass culture, but in the end remained this kind of hybrid gesture, not really seriously lived in full time. The early work of Louis Kahn, on the other hand, gave no hint that he would emerge as the most significant architect of the mid-20th century. He studied beaux arts in the 1920s. During the Depression, Kahn designed low-income housing. In the 1950s, he won a fellowship to the American Academy in Rome. Living among the ruins of Rome caused Kahn to remain, committed to the goals of modernism, but yet open to the works of the past, especially the grand vaulted spaces of the Romans and the massive fortress towers of medieval Europe. So his works kind of combined modern innovation in materials with historically tinged language. He is really the first postmodern architect, and we're going to learn about postmodern architecture tomorrow. Residues of Kahn's beaux arts background reappeared in the U-shaped plan of the Kimball Art Museum at Fort Worth, Texas in 1972. Building something in shape very reminiscent of a Roman bathhouse, but with entirely modern materials, modern technology, and reinforced concrete. Now we could go over the life and career of this very interesting architect, Louis Kahn, but I think instead we should dive into just one captivating story of Louis Kahn's National Assembly here, this masterpiece born from a collision of cultures. So picture this, it's the post-colonial era in India, this time of immense change and ambition. Louis Kahn, this architect with dreams as grand as his visions, receives a commission that's nothing short of his ultimate dreams. He's invited to work on a project in Dhaka, Bangladesh, where the Committee for a New Capital Complex seeks his expertise. But how did Kahn, this American architect with a strong Jewish identity, find himself in the heart of post-colonial South Asia? Well, it's a story that starts with one of Kahn's former students, now involved in this military Islamic coup that had seized control of East Pakistan in 1958. This student, impressed by Kahn's genius, actually recommended him to the committee overseeing the development of this brand new country, Bangladesh's new capital. And just like that, Kahn's journey to create something truly monumental began. Now let's talk about his vision. Kahn didn't just want to build buildings, he wanted to create citadels, symbols of power and grandeur that would stand the test of time like the ancient architects. Drawing inspiration from Islamic Mughal architecture like the majestic red forts of Agra and Delhi, Kahn envisioned structures that would exude authority and beauty in the modern age. But this wasn't just about aesthetics. Kahn understood the significance of symbolism, thinking very much like a postmodern architect. He separated the citadels with this kind of V-shaped lake, a nod to Bangladesh's waterbound nature. And with East Pakistan declaring independence and becoming Bangladesh in 1971, Kahn's vision endured, culminating in the completion of the National Assembly in 1982. Now let's talk about the very unique construction method. So Kahn's design was, very bold and ambitious, obviously, but the means to build it were anything but modern. Here in Bangladesh, thousands of workers, mostly women, had to toil tirelessly to hand build this capital. There was no modern machinery, so they transported concrete in baskets on their heads to pour into these slit forms. And so this slow, labor-intensive process resulted in a very unique texture on the walls, resulting from the limit of each day's pour being marked by placing marble strips, leaving this kind of panel-like surface of 5-foot bands across the capital. Now, as the National Assembly took shape, its design spoke volumes. The rounded and squared apses resembled a medieval castle. And let's not forget about the Barbican entryway, subtly skewed to align with the southwest Qibla to Mecca, a testament to Kahn's attention to detail and cultural sensitivity. But perhaps the most striking feature of Khan's design was the deliberate cutting out of colossal figures from the outer walls, revealing inner layers, and this is reminiscent of Islamic Persian architecture. So these dark gaps resembling kind of shady divan arches from Persian architecture added depth and complexity to the structure, embodying Khan's mastery of form and function. In the end, Khan's National Assembly was more than just a building. It was a miracle of sorts, a transcultural kind of synthesis, if you will, blending influences from East and West, past and present. It was this very important symbol of post-colonialism, a chance for a new country to redefine itself in its relationship with the world. And as for Khan, it was a masterpiece that would stand as a testament to his genius for generations to come, and a really nice lead in to the next and final lecture, Postmodern Architecture.